Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, written by Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, Lama Rod Owens, with Jasmine Syedullah, Ph.D. Read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz, June 29th, 2022. Introduction. Enter here. Radical Challenge, written by Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams. Radical, relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching or thorough, derived from radix, going to the root. Dharma, universal truth. The Black radical tradition is foundational to people who are not Black, for it is only with the liberation of Black people that humanity can be freed from its chains of oppression, just as Black people cannot be liberated while humanity is in chains. Why radical? We live in a culture in which our first reaction and response to something we don't like or are uncomfortable with is to want to change it. We want it to go away, so we want to change it. What we have not learned to do is to give ourselves the space and time to simply observe it as it is, to make friends with it, as powerfully painful as that may be. With all due respect to Gandhi, we can no longer afford to just be the change. We actually have to be the transformation, which is to say we have to transcend the form and construct that we find ourselves in. The only way we can do that is to observe the construct that we're in instead of trying to tinker with it right away, with the same blind spots that we came to the problem with. Immediately we get out our tools, and you know the saying that when you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail, and so we start hammering away, but we've exhausted the hammer and require new tools. We cannot see that if we won't observe what is, because we are trying so hard to get away from it. We are trying to evade the grief and trauma of our own racism, and our internalized racism, and our continuous perpetuation of racism and classism and other forms of oppression on ourselves and others every single day. Every single one of us, just like in our personal lives. We've often had some kind of floor falling out beneath us experience, and some of us get it and some of us don't. If we don't respond to each opportunity that opens up, we need greater falls from greater heights before we look at ourselves in the mirror and say, oh, I've actually called this moment to me to recognize that I need to make some kind of fundamental shift. As a society, we are in danger of needing larger and larger social wake-up calls and shocks to the system. At a social global scale, this translates into more strident demagogues, more desperate and deeply fundamentalist takeovers, massive cultural disruption and human displacement, more vicious, faceless wars, and literally larger openings in the earth to swallow us up. A union of ideals, the greater sum of parts. By the grace of many Eastern traditions, teachers, and ancestors, white Western Dharma communities have at their disposal profoundly liberating teachings and practices that have the power to sever at their very root the destructive behaviors and thought processes that we inherit by way of our birth into human bodies. But we have largely refused to turn the great light of this collective wisdom of mind, body, and spirit onto the systems that bestow unearned privileges, positions, and profit. In so doing, we diminish the precious truths we have chosen to steward. We must take a stand. Movements for Black liberation cast their bodies into resisting the systems and instruments of oppression. Our bodies take the shape of and thus illuminate the contours of the most insidious force of systemic dehumanization and destruction ever imagined, one which has led the global community into a downward spiral of self-annihilation. Our insistent march exemplifies a grace and forbearance that humbles and inspires direct confrontation with the truth, widening the path of justice towards liberation for all people. We are propelled by the essential human compulsion for freedom, but we can also be driven by centuries of pain and carrying a burden greater than people should have ever known. Our healing cannot wait until the structures acquiesce, are dismantled, or come undone. We must take a seat. Each community possesses, as Gandhi offered, a piece of the truth, of Dharma. When we seek the embodiment of these truths, giving ourselves permission to be more honest, more healed, more whole, more complete, when we become radical, neither the path of solely inward-looking liberation nor the pursuit of an externalized social liberation prevails. Rather, a third space, as yet unknown, emerges. It is a radical Dharma, and it is ours. Lama Rod, Jasmine, and I bridge these communities. We cast our bodies into the third space that emerges when radically inhibiting the two, the inner and outer paths toward liberation. We do it out of necessity, choice, for healing, and the unwavering faith that comes from having touched and been touched by the truth. We offer our own truth and have brought forth the truth and inquiries of others that are stretching to bridge these terrains. The terrains are expressed as dichotomies only because we have not yet completed our work. But we know in our bodies we must one day abide there, inner and outer, personal and social, love and justice, liberation. To inhabit radical as an ideal is to commit to going beyond one's familiar or even chosen terrain. It avails you to what you weren't willing to see, which is the place truth resides. To embody that truth is to live beyond the limits of self-reinforcing habits, which take the narrative of the past, project it onto the future, and obscure the present, leaving us to sleepwalk in the dreamscape of other people's desires and determinations. It is to transcend the borders erected by pain, fear, and apathy, to discover a new territory unbound by the privileges and preferences that trade freedom for familiarity and comfort, but pretend that they are one and the same. Because by definition it can never be static. To be radical is to constantly live in the territory yet undiscovered, the liberation yet unknown. New Dharma, radical Dharma. It wouldn't be an overstatement to say that the discovery and assertion of Siddhartha Gautama, the historic Buddha, that every human being, irrespective of caste, race, creed, or birth, has within them the potential for waking up to the ultimate nature of reality, is one of the most radically life-altering propositions for human life on and in relationship to the planet. One that we need right now. Yet at this time when the Dharma is needed more acutely than ever, a time when our very existence is threatened as a result of our socially embedded greed, hatred, and ignorance, its expansive potential to liberate us from suffering is in danger of being rendered impotent because it is held in subjugation to the very systems that it must thoroughly examine. Thrust into the Western socio-economic framework that puts profit above all, and coupled with a desire to perpetuate institutional existence at the expense of illuminating reality and revealing deeper truths, the Dharma has become beholden to commodification as inescapable and de rigueur. Authenticity and integrity are thus compromised. Much of what is being taught is the acceptance of a kinder, gentler suffering that does not question the unwholesome roots of systemic suffering and the structures that hold it in place. What is required is a new Dharma, a radical Dharma that deconstructs rather than amplifies systems of suffering, that starves rather than fertilizes the soil of the conditions that the deep roots of societal suffering grow in. A new Dharma is one that insists that we investigate not only the unsatisfactoriness of our own minds, but also prepares us for the discomfort of confronting the obscurations of the society we are individual expressions of. It recognizes that the delusions of systemic oppression are not solely the domain of the individual. By design, they are seated within and reinforced by society. We must wake up and cut through not only individual but also social ego. This is not only our potential, but we now each have it as our collective responsibility. As Dharma communities, this includes people belonging to white-led, Western communities of convert Buddhists, but also next-generation yogis, Advaitins, Sikhs, and adopters of other Eastern traditions. We must also do so strategically and with great haste. There is no neutral. We are at a critical moment in the history of the nation as well as within the Buddhist teaching and tradition in America. This is the back-of-the-bus moment of our time. 50 years after civil rights laws were laid down, it is clear that they were enshrined within a structure that continues to profit from anti-black racism. The necessary bias that the system requires in order to be perpetuated has permeated into our sanghas, our spiritual communities, and in this very moment we are called to put aside business as usual. If you have ever wondered how you would have shown up in the face of the challenge put before white America when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, upending the accepted social order, now is the time you will find out. For Western convert Buddhist America, this is the time when we will actually embody our practice and teachings, or not. Our inability as a nation to honor the theft of these lands and the building of wealth, power, and privilege on the countless backs and graves of black people is our most significant obstacle to being at peace with ourselves, and thus with the world. Buddhist community is a mirror image. The Buddhist community is a mirror image of this deep internal conflict that arises out of a persistent resistance to playing its appropriate societal role, even as we have available to us rigorous teachings to the contrary. This is a clarifying moment about who we are as individuals, but also who we have been thus far, as a collective of people laying claim to the teachings of the Buddha, waving the flag of wisdom and compassion all the while. As demographics shift, ushering in increasingly racially diverse pools of seekers, this reluctance promises to be our undoing. We simply cannot engage with either the ills or promises of society if we continue to turn a blind eye to the egregious and willful ignorance that enables us to still not get it in so many ways. It is by no means our making, but given the culture we are emerging from and immersed in, we are responsible. White folks' particular reluctance to acknowledge impact as a collective, while continuing to benefit from the construct of the collective, leaves a wound intact, without a dressing. The air needed to breathe through forgiveness is smothered. Healing is suspended for all. Truth is necessary for reconciliation. Will we express the promise of and commitment to liberation for all beings, or will we instead continue a hyper-individualized salvation model, the myth of meritocracy that is the foundation of this country's untruth? The work being done in Dharma communities is the same work being done by the America that wants to live up to its promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Collectively, we must kick the habit of racism, cultural dominance, and the upholding of oppressive systems. More poignantly, our challenge, our responsibility, our deep, resounding call is to be at the forefront of this overdue evolutionary thrust forward. Why? Because we choose to position ourselves as the standard bearers of an ethical high ground, and we have the tools and the teachings to do so. There is no neutral. Whose liberation? We are in a moment in which the attention of our nation is rightfully turned to the policing of black and brown bodies. From above, it looks like just black and brown folks are being policed, and, while you may feel bad, at least you're free. The policing we are witnessing is expressing itself through the state. The police force is the state institution carrying out a specific mandate. The mandate expresses an energetic need. The mandate is to control black bodies. The need is to have the constant specter of the other. When the other exists, it strengthens your need to belong. Your belonging is necessary for compliance. Your compliance maintains the system. You are policed too. You are policed by your need for belonging. Your need for belonging requires control of the other, or at least the illusion of it. You are policed through the control of my body. You are policed too. Once you are aware of how you are being policed, you can begin the process of self-liberating from the position of realizing the mutuality of our liberation rather than suffering under the delusion that you are doing something for me. There is an intimacy in that realization, and because Dharma is ultimately about accepting what is, it can undermine the need for control that keeps you invested in the policing of my body, thus freeing yours. The social ego. To lean into this aspiration, you must confront the fact that, quote-unquote, whiteness is a social ego as void of inherent identity as the personal ego, and you have identified with it as much as your very own name, but without being willing to name it. Just as the ego mind is a construct that constantly reinforces itself, building structures and systems of control and developing attitudes and views that maintain its primacy and sense of solidity so that it can substantiate its validity, so too does this construct of whiteness. One could call it the mind of whiteness. The construct has been designed so that white America, and by extension white teachers and practitioners, lives inside that prison of that small mind, such that without intentional intervention you cannot see over the wall of the reinforcing perspectives that affirm and perpetuate the white superiority complex. The complex would disintegrate if the vastness of your own racial bias were illuminated. So you remain in ignorance, blind to the reality before you, which is necessary to escape the sheer anguish of how pervasive it is, how you unerringly participate, and how seemingly inescapable it is. But just as the ego mind cannot be used to work its way out of its own construct, so too can the mind of whiteness not be used to see through the veil of its own construct. On the one hand, this is where a practice that illuminates the nature of mind comes in. We are gifted with precisely the tools and methodologies needed for the project of deconstructing. But the lens of awareness must be placed outside of the construct. As a direct result of privilege, white practitioners and teachers have mistakenly entitled themselves to place the lens of awareness inside of whiteness. Hence, they are unable to see its machinations. But once we choose to live Dharma in a radical way, a motivation toward complete liberation, our work can begin. So we sit, and we feel, and we let what arises do so until the resistance is worn down or moved through or even seems to overwhelm us. On the other side, we see a glimmer of something that we couldn't get a handle on for our desperate need to avoid it. We begin to see truth. And when we catch a hold of it, we can finally see the patterns of our participation in not truth emerge. With the clarity of a steady mind and courage of a true heart, what has always been there begins to reveal itself, emerging from behind the fog of this social ego, the mind of whiteness. The white practitioners of Dharma who cannot stand firmly in acknowledging the pain caused by the decades of resistance to addressing this misalignment will be exposed as using a veneer of the Dharma as mere window dressing while milking the benefits of the system. Our wise words will land with a thud henceforth. The veil of mindfulness will be seen through as thin. No one entity has the answer, but rather it is the willingness to offer our best, to claim responsibility for our worst, and fold it all into continuous moment-to-moment practice of simply being present to what is, that promises to deliver our future. The social monastery. I think we've mistaken the so-called hero's journey. We believe that we can go on retreat into the monastery looking for something and get enlightened and then come out into the world as enlightened beings. But as people who are not monastics, our profound insight only comes in direct relationship with the world, the field of our practice. It is our relationship to the outer world that is the source of our awakening. We then bring the insight to the monastery, where we hone and integrate it during retreat. We bring the integration into society, into how we inhabit the environment, into our sanghas and communities, into how we see and treat people, and into how we let ourselves be seen. If we can do that, we come back more awake. If the fruit of practice is not a desire to respond to the world, if it just remains in response to your own needs, quote-unquote, me is all you are seeing. I want to feel better. I want to feel like a spiritual person. I want to be seen as right, but I don't want to actually be responsible for the world that I'm in. Then you have not really woken up yet. For myself, I couldn't theorize a radical Dharma, but rather had to seek to live it through principles and practices that lean toward liberation. To embody, to use my body as the testing ground out in the world, to give myself over to a field of play in which everything is allowed to happen. Examination, experimentation, failure, lots of joyous failure, into emergence. Then I step back and observe what it gives rise to. What I discover and rediscover is a third space neither contained by a Dharma written in scripture nor apart from it. A new Dharma, a radical Dharma, beyond Buddhism. Finally, we must also be willing to release a false sense of ownership and the compulsion to capitalize in order for the Dharma to assume its rightful place as the connective tissue among the people, inhabited groups, institutions, and organizations of this societal body, infusing wisdom, compassion, and unconditional love into every breath, at all levels, in all corners, and across all boundaries of race, color, caste, creed, and religion. Kaleidoscope. How to Use This Book by Jasmine Syedullah, Ph.D. Kaleidoscope is a word derived from the ancient Greek kalos, meaning beautiful, beauty, eidos, meaning that which is seen, form and shape, and scope, meaning to look to or to examine. Hence, the observation of beautiful forms. There are a variety of lenses through which the book can be viewed. All are ways to observe the beauty, a means of living an increasingly more radical Dharma, becoming that which we wish to see in the world. This is a talking book. You can read it cover to cover on your own, for yourself, or you can read it in sections, out loud, in groups. It's designed to begin the conversations we need to build new communities. To that end, we invite you to consider some of the practical and political ways we chose to represent connections between our own personal liberation and collective movement liberation. Transitions, beginnings and endings. Abiding in a sense of the ceremony, some sections begin with an invocation and end with a dedication of merit. These are the bits of ritual we use to frame our own dialogues and pass along to you as possible ways to engage in these conversations along with us. Style and grace. While race is a social construct, blackness comes into this conversation as more than a racial category. Blackness is a distinctly political orientation to liberation that is activist, communal, and on the move. It is a generational tradition of collective resistance to white supremacy that began with the resistance of untold numbers of women, men, and children to the first glimpses of the capture and crime of New World slavery. It is a practice of love and liberation that persists into the present day. While racial categories can be used as simple catch-alls, practical ways to order and distinguish between, as W.E.B. Du Bois writes, the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone. In the pages that follow, we capitalize the B in black, while leaving the W lowercase in white, to call up the peculiar historic violence of black racial formation. We capitalize the B in black to call up the tradition of movement for collective liberation, both spiritual and political, that has inspired the context in which these conversations are unfolding. It is a tradition of liberation informed by racial categories, but not limited by the kinds of violence racism imprints on our identity as black people. We capitalize the B, but not the W, not to preserve or reverse the racism of white supremacy, but to situate our racial identity within a radically conscious idea of history, one in which the presence of black people in the spheres of anti-black racism has made wholesale social transformation both inconceivable and inevitable, a way of getting past the limitations of identity politics without passing over the particular politics of our embodiment. The book inside the book. Nestled in between our essays, there is a book within a book, the conversations that took Radical Dharma on the road. In the course of the Radical Dharma tour, from Atlanta to Brooklyn to Boston to Berkeley, we noted how place, both physical, edifice, and region, shaped the tenor and texture of our conversations. While the chapters on race, love, and liberation were compiled from the various locations of our Radical Dharma conversations, the chapters do not distinguish where each particular exchange took place. The tone and feel of each place was inflected by the venue, the people, the local culture and politics of the cities that hosted them. We are indebted to the communities that made these conversations so rich and full of heart. We invite you to dip into them, feel them out, and imagine how they might unfold in your own cities, in your local communities. Returning to the circle, now and again. Feedback from early readers suggests that it's useful to read the preface again after you read the conversations. The book, like a conversation, is circular in design. It begins by setting the context of the present moment, goes to the past, brings us forward, and then opens space for conversation. Especially if this is new for you, returning to the context with a new set of eyes is the best way to situate what people are speaking into. How's that sound? Nothing conveys mood like music, so relevant chapters will also be accompanied by song lyrics, reflective of a combination of the author's predilections and thematic soundtracks for the topic. Some choices will surprise and reveal the myriad influences of a generation that began to defy identity constructs and expected norms. In one work session, the Radical Dharma team took time to pay homage and watched the newly released video for Rihanna's Bitch Better Have My Money, in which the artist kidnaps and tortures her accountant's wife, ending in Rihanna covered in blood. Girl power meets gore. How's that for new Dharma? This has been Chapter 1 of Radical Dharma, written by Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, Lama Rod Owens, and Jasmine Syedullah. This first chapter was written by Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams. Read and recorded by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz, June 29th, 2022.